My name is Jacob, and I'm 24 years old. What I'm about to share with you is a horrifying experience that changed my life forever. It all started on a cold, dreary night in late October. I had just moved into my grandmother's old Victorian house. She had passed away a few months earlier, leaving the property to me. The house was a looming structure with creaky floorboards and drafty windows that whistled in the wind. But it was free, and as a struggling artist, I couldn't pass up the opportunity. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days painting in the sunroom and my nights exploring the nooks and crannies of the old house. That is, until I discovered the attic. It was a particularly stormy night when I first heard the noise, a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere above my bedroom. At first, I dismissed it as rats in the walls or perhaps a branch scraping against the roof. But as the nights went on, the sounds grew louder, more insistent. One night, unable to sleep due to the incessant scratching, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the narrow staircase that led to the attic. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step sending shivers down my spine. As I reached the top, I fumbled for the light switch. The bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the dusty floor. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten relics of my family's past. But what caught my eye was a large ornate mirror propped against the far wall. I approached it cautiously, my reflection distorted in its tarnished surface. That's when I saw it, a flicker of movement behind me. I whirled around, but there was nothing there. Heart pounding, I turned back to the mirror, and there it was, a face not my own, staring back at me from the depths of the glass. It was pale, almost translucent, with hollow eyes and a gaping mouth. I stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of boxes. When I looked again, the face was gone. Convinced I was seeing things due to lack of sleep, I hurried back to my room. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I lay awake, listening to the scratching sounds that now seemed to be coming from inside the walls. The next day, I tried to rationalize what I had seen. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I spent the day researching the history of the house, hoping to find some explanation for the strange occurrences. What I discovered chilled me to the bone. The house had a dark past, filled with tragedy and unexplained deaths. The most recent was that of a young woman who had lived in the attic room. She had disappeared without a trace 50 years ago, leaving behind only a broken mirror. That night, the scratching was louder than ever. It was accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to echo through the entire house. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to confront whatever was in the attic. Armed with nothing but a crucifix I had found in one of my grandmother's drawers, I ascended the stairs once more. The attic was pitch black, my flashlight beam barely penetrating the darkness. The air was thick with dust and the musty smell of decay. I made my way to the mirror, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. In its surface, I saw not my reflection, but a room, the attic as it might have looked 50 years ago. And there in the corner was the young woman, her eyes wide with terror. Suddenly, an invisible force grabbed me, pulling me towards the mirror. I struggled, but it was too strong. As I was dragged closer, the glass began to ripple like water. The woman in the mirror reached out, her fingers breaking through the surface. In a panic, I swung the crucifix at the mirror. There was a deafening crack, and the glass shattered into 1,000 pieces. The force released me, and I fell backward, gasping for air. In the silence that followed, I heard a whisper. "Thank you," it said before fading away like mist in the morning sun. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my room, jumping at every creak and groan of the old house. When dawn finally broke, I packed my bags and left, never to return. Years have passed since that terrifying night, but the memories still haunt me. Sometimes when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I see a flicker of something else, a pale face, hollow eyes, a gaping mouth. And I wonder if, in freeing that poor soul, I somehow trapped a part of myself in that shattered mirror. So if you ever find yourself in an old attic, face to face with an antique mirror, remember my story, because what's looking back at you might not be your reflection at all. But my story doesn't end there. The horrors I experienced in that attic were just the beginning of a nightmare that would follow me for years to come. After fleeing the house, I tried to put the experience behind me. I moved to a small apartment in the city, threw myself into my art, and did everything I could to forget about the mirror and the trapped soul I had encountered. But forgetting proved impossible. It started with small things. Objects moving when I wasn't looking, shadows flickering in the corner of my eye. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, feeling a weight on my chest and sensing a presence in the room. But whenever I turned on the light, there was nothing there. As the days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the occurrences became more frequent and more terrifying. I'd find scratches on my skin that I couldn't explain, always in sets of 3, as if left by spectral claws. My paintings, once filled with light and color, became dark and twisted, depicting nightmarish scenes I didn't remember creating. One night, I woke to find myself standing in front of my bathroom mirror with no recollection of how I got there. In the mirror, I saw not my own reflection, but the face of the woman from the attic. Her eyes were filled with a mixture of gratitude and sorrow. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear. I blinked and she was gone, replaced by my own terrified face. Desperate for answers, I reached out to a local paranormal investigator. Her name was Dr. Eleanor Reeves, and she listened to my story with a mix of skepticism and intrigue. "What you're describing," she said, "sounds like a classic case of a spirit attachment. When you broke the mirror, you may have released the trapped soul, but in doing so, you created a connection between you and the spirit world." Dr. Reeves agreed to help me, and together we began to delve deeper into the history of my grandmother's house and the woman who had disappeared. We discovered her name was Lillian Green, and she had been a promising young artist, much like myself. She had moved into the attic room to focus on her art, but her work had taken a dark turn in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. As we dug deeper, we uncovered a chilling truth. Lillian hadn't just disappeared, she had been murdered. The killer was never caught, but evidence suggested it was someone close to her, someone who had become obsessed with her and her art. Armed with this knowledge, Dr. Reeves suggested we perform a ritual to help Lillian's spirit find peace and sever the connection between us. We returned to the old Victorian house, which had remained empty since I'd fled. The attic was exactly as I'd left it, the shattered remains of the mirror still scattered across the floor. As night fell, we began the ritual. Candles flickered in the drafty attic as Dr. Reeves chanted in a language I didn't understand. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could see my breath misting in the air. The candles guttered and went out, plunging us into darkness. And then I saw her. Lillian materialized before us, her form translucent and shimmering. She looked at me with those same sad eyes I'd seen in the mirror. But this time, I could hear her voice, a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I'm sorry," she said. "I never meant to drag you into this, but I needed help. I needed someone to know the truth." As she spoke, another figure began to take shape behind her. It was a man, his features twisted with rage and jealousy. I recognized him from the old photographs we'd uncovered in our research. Lillian's mentor and secret admirer. "He killed me," Lillian's spirit continued. "He couldn't bear the thought of me leaving, of my art evolving beyond his influence. So he trapped my soul in the mirror, keeping me with him forever." The male spirit lunged forward, his hands reaching for Lillian. But this time, she was ready. With a burst of spectral energy, she pushed him back. "No more," she said firmly. "You no longer have power over me." Dr. Reeves' chanting grew louder, and I felt a surge of energy course through the room. The two spirits began to fade, their forms becoming less distinct. Lillian turned to me one last time. "Thank you," she said, her voice growing fainter. "You've set us both free." With a final flash of light, both spirits vanished. The candles reignited, casting a warm glow across the attic. Dr. Reeves slumped to the floor, exhausted but triumphant. "It's over," she said. "They've moved on." In the days that followed, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The nightmares ceased, the unexplained occurrences stopped, and I felt truly free for the first time in months. My art took on a new life, inspired by the experience but no longer dominated by darkness. But the experience left its mark on me. I couldn't look at mirrors the same way again, always half expecting to see something other than my own reflection staring back at me. And sometimes, late at night, I could swear I heard the faint sound of scratching coming from the walls. I've since moved away from that city, trying to put as much distance as possible between myself and the house that started it all. But I know now that distance doesn't matter when it comes to the spirit world. The veil between our world and theirs is thin, and sometimes all it takes is a broken mirror to tear it apart. I've dedicated my life to researching paranormal phenomena, working alongside Dr. Reeves to help others who find themselves caught between worlds. Every case reminds me of my own brush with the supernatural, of the terror I felt in that attic, and of the sad eyes of a trapped soul looking back at me from a tarnished mirror. So I urge you, dear reader, to be cautious. The world is full of mysteries, and not all of them are benign. If you ever find yourself in an old attic, facing an antique mirror, remember my story. And if you ever feel a chill run down your spine, or catch a glimpse of something unexplainable in your reflection, don't ignore it. Because sometimes the horrors we dismiss as imagination are all too real. As for me, I'll never forget the true creepy attic horror story that changed my life. It's a reminder that there's more to our world than what we can see, and that sometimes the most terrifying things are those that lurk just beyond the edge of our perception, waiting for a chance to break through. The experience in the attic and its aftermath had profoundly changed me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, jumping at shadows and avoiding mirrors whenever possible. My art, once a source of joy and expression, had become a conduit for the darkness I'd encountered. Each brushstroke seemed to reveal new horrors, as if my subconscious was still processing the trauma I'd endured. Nights were the worst. Even though the scratching had stopped and Lillian's spirit had moved on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I'd wake up in cold sweats, my heart pounding, convinced that I'd seen a pale face peering at me from the darkest corner of my room. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. My relationships suffered. Friends and family grew concerned about my increasingly erratic behavior. How could I explain to them what I'd been through? Who would believe that I'd encountered a spirit trapped in a mirror, or that I'd been part of an otherworldly battle in my grandmother's attic? I withdrew from social interactions, finding solace only in my work with Dr. Reeves and our paranormal investigations. One case in particular brought all the horrors rushing back. We were called to investigate an old boarding school that had been converted into apartments. The residents reported strange occurrences, disembodied whispers, objects moving on their own, and most chillingly, reflections in mirrors that didn't match reality. As soon as we entered the building, I felt a familiar chill run down my spine. The air was heavy with the same oppressive energy I'd felt in my grandmother's attic. As we made our way through the winding corridors, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, followed by unseen eyes. We set up our equipment in one of the most active apartments. The tenant, a young woman named Sarah, had reported seeing a young boy in her mirror, his eyes pleading for help. As night fell and we prepared for our investigation, I found myself drawn to the large, ornate mirror hanging in Sarah's living room. Staring into its depths, I felt a pull, an almost magnetic attraction. The surface of the mirror began to ripple, just as it had in the attic years ago. And there, emerging from the silvery depths, was the face of a young boy, no more than 10 years old. His eyes were wide with fear, his mouth open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. Dr. Reeves rushed to my side, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the mirror. The boy's face had vanished, but I could still feel his presence, his desperation. Over the next few hours, we documented numerous paranormal activities, temperature drops, unexplained noises, and most disturbingly, clear EVP recordings of a child's voice begging for help. But it was what happened at the stroke of midnight that truly shook me to my core. All at once, every reflective surface in the apartment, mirrors, windows, even the screen of Dr. Reeves's laptop came to life. In each one, we could see the boy, but from different angles, as if we were looking into different rooms of a house long gone. In one, he cowered in a corner. In another, he ran down a hallway. And in the large living room mirror, we saw him confronted by a looming, shadowy figure. The air crackled with energy, and I felt that same pull I'd experienced years ago. Without thinking, I reached out towards the mirror. Dr. Reeves shouted a warning, but it was too late. My fingers brushed the surface, and I felt myself being pulled in. For a moment that felt like an eternity, I was somewhere else. A dark, cold place that reeked of fear and hopelessness. I could hear the boy's cries echoing around me. Feel the malevolent presence that had trapped him here. With all my strength, I reached out, trying to find him in the darkness. My fingers closed around something small and cold, a child's hand. I pulled, fighting against the force that tried to keep him trapped. There was a sensation of shattering, of breaking through, and suddenly I was back in Sarah's apartment, sprawled on the floor with the boy beside me. He was solid, real, no longer a mere reflection. He looked at me with tears in his eyes and whispered a thank you before his form began to fade, growing transparent until he vanished completely. The oppressive energy that had filled the apartment dissipated, leaving behind a sense of peace. In the aftermath of that night, we pieced together the boy's story. His name was Timothy, and he had been a student at the boarding school in the 1950s. He had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, his body never found. The shadowy figure we'd seen was the school's headmaster, a cruel man who had been suspected of abusing students but never charged. Timothy's spirit had been trapped for decades, reliving his final terrifying moments. By reaching through the mirror, I had somehow broken the cycle, allowing him to move on. But the experience had left its mark on me. For weeks after, I was plagued by vivid nightmares. I'd dream of being trapped in an endless maze of mirrors, each one showing a different lost soul begging for help. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my voice hoarse from screaming. Dr. Reeves suggested that my connection to the spirit world had grown stronger, that by saving Timothy, I had opened myself up as a conduit for other trapped spirits. It was both a gift and a curse. I could help lost souls find peace, but at what cost to my own sanity? I threw myself into research, studying every book on the paranormal I could find. I learned about different types of hauntings, about the nature of spirits and the thin veil between worlds. I practiced meditation and protection techniques, trying to strengthen my mind against the onslaught of spectral energy. But no matter how much I learned, no matter how many spirits I helped, I couldn't shake the feeling that something darker was lurking just beyond my perception. Sometimes in the depths of night, I'd catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure in my peripheral vision. Was it Timothy's abuser, angry that I'd freed his victim? Or was it something older, something that had been watching me since that first night in the attic? My life had become a waking nightmare, a constant battle against forces I barely understood. Every mirror was a potential portal, every shadow a possible threat. I lived on the edge, never knowing when I might be called upon to reach across the veil and pull another lost soul to safety. And yet, despite the terror and the sleepless nights, I couldn't bring myself to stop. Every spirit I helped find peace eased the burden of guilt I carried from that first encounter with Lillian. Every thank you whispered by a fading apparition reminded me that I was making a difference, that my suffering had purpose. But in my heart, I knew the truth. This was more than a calling. It was an obsession. The spirit world had its hooks in me, and I wasn't sure I wanted to break free. Because as terrifying as it was to confront these otherworldly horrors, the thought of returning to a normal life, of pretending the veil didn't exist, was even more frightening. So I continue on this path, walking the line between two worlds. Each day brings new challenges, new spirits seeking help, new horrors to confront. And each night, as I lie in bed staring at the shadows on my wall, I wonder, will this be the night something reaches back? Will this be the time I reach through a mirror and can't find my way back? The attic where it all began is long behind me, but its legacy lives on in every case I take, in every spirit I encounter. That true creepy attic horror story was just the beginning of a journey that has no end in sight, a journey through the darkest corners of our world and the terrifying spaces that exist beyond it. So if you ever find yourself standing before a mirror, feeling that unmistakable chill run down your spine, remember my story and ask yourself, are you ready to see what's really looking back at you from the other side? Because once you've glimpsed the truth, there's no going back. The veil will be lifted and you'll be forever changed, just as I was on that fateful night in my grandmother's attic. As the years passed, my reputation in the paranormal community grew. Dr. Reeves and I became the go-to team for the most challenging and terrifying cases. Haunted houses, possessed objects, and restless spirits became our specialty. But with each case, I felt myself slipping further from the world of the living and deeper into the realm of the dead. One particularly harrowing case led us to an abandoned asylum on the outskirts of a small Midwestern town. The locals spoke in hushed whispers about the horrors that had taken place within its walls. Cruel experiments, neglected patients, and countless unexplained deaths. As soon as we stepped onto the grounds, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The asylum loomed before us, a decaying monument to human suffering. Its windows were dark, empty eyes staring out at the overgrown grounds. As we made our way inside, the air grew thick with the musty smell of decay and something else, a coppery scent that made my stomach churn. Our equipment went haywire as soon as we crossed the threshold. EMF meters spiked, cameras malfunctioned, and our audio recorders picked up a cacophony of whispers and screams. But it was what I saw with my own eyes that truly chilled me to the bone. Shadows moved independently of any light source, darting along the walls and ceiling. Doors slammed shut of their own accord, trapping us in narrow corridors. And everywhere I looked, I saw faces, gaunt, hollow-eyed faces of the asylum's former patients, their expressions frozen in eternal anguish. As we delved deeper into the asylum's labyrinthine halls, I felt a familiar pull. It led me to a room at the end of a long corridor, the electroshock therapy room. The rusted equipment still stood in the center, a grim reminder of the treatments once administered here. And there, reflected in a cracked mirror on the wall, I saw him, a man in a doctor's coat, his face twisted into a cruel smile. In his hands, he held the electrodes, sparks dancing between them. Behind him, I could see the ghostly forms of patients strapped to chairs, their bodies convulsing in agony. I knew in that moment that this was the source of the asylum's haunting, a sadistic doctor who had used his position to torture and experiment on his vulnerable patients. His evil had left an indelible mark on this place, trapping the souls of his victims in an endless cycle of suffering. Without thinking, I reached out toward the mirror. The surface rippled and gave way, and I felt myself being pulled through. Dr. Reeves's shouts faded away as I was plunged into a nightmarish version of the asylum. Here, in this spectral plane, the asylum was alive with activity. Ghostly patients wandered the halls, their eyes vacant and unseeing. The air was filled with screams and the buzz of electricity, and at the center of it all was the doctor, moving from room to room, inflicting pain with gleeful abandon. I tried to intervene, to stop him, but my hands passed right through him. I was a mere observer in this realm of tortured souls. But then I realized I wasn't here to confront the doctor. I was here to free his victims. One by one, I approached the ghostly patients. I spoke to them softly, helping them remember who they were before this place broke them. With each soul I reached, a little more light returned to their eyes. They began to remember their lives, their families, their hopes and dreams. But the doctor noticed what I was doing. With a roar of rage, he charged towards me, electrodes crackling in his hands. I braced myself for the impact, but it never came. Instead, I felt a surge of energy coursing through me. The freed souls had formed a protective circle around me. Their combined energy pushed back against the doctor's malevolence. I watched in awe as they grew brighter, their forms becoming more solid as they reclaimed their identities. With a final deafening scream, the doctor's spirit shattered like glass. The asylum around us began to crumble, the walls fading away to reveal a bright, warm light. One by one, the souls I had helped stepped into that light, finally finding the peace that had been denied to them for so long. As the last of them faded away, I felt a gentle tug. The world shifted, and suddenly I was back in the real asylum, sprawled on the floor of the electroshock room. Dr. Reeves was kneeling beside me, her face etched with worry. In the days that followed, we documented the sudden and dramatic decrease in paranormal activity at the asylum. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, and even the building itself seemed less foreboding. We had broken the cycle of suffering that had plagued this place for decades. But the experience had taken its toll on me. For weeks, I was plagued by vivid nightmares of the asylum. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the phantom pain of electrodes on my temples. Even when I was awake, I'd catch glimpses of the patients in reflective surfaces, their grateful eyes following me. I knew then that I had reached a crossroads. My connection to the spirit world had grown so strong that I was in danger of losing myself entirely. Each time I crossed over, it became harder to find my way back. The line between the world of the living and the realm of the dead was blurring, and I wasn't sure on which side I truly belonged. Dr. Reeves suggested I take a break, step back from our investigations for a while. But how could I, knowing there were more souls out there in need of help? How could I turn my back on the gift, or curse, that allowed me to bring peace to the restless dead? In the end, I chose to continue, but I set new boundaries, developed new techniques to protect myself from the psychic toll of our work. I learned to ground myself in the physical world, to find anchors that would always guide me back from the other side. My experiences have taught me that the veil between worlds is thinner than most people realize. Every mirror is a potential portal. Every shadow could hide a spirit in need of help or a malevolent entity seeking to break through. The attic where my journey began was just the first step on a path that has led me to the darkest corners of human experience and the most profound depths of the supernatural world. So I continue my work, walking the line between two realities. Each case brings new horrors, new challenges, and new opportunities to bring light to the darkness. And each time I stand before a mirror, preparing to reach through to the other side, I remember the terrified young man I once was, standing in his grandmother's attic, unaware of the journey that lay ahead. That true creepy attic. Horror Story was just the beginning. It opened my eyes to a world beyond our own, a world of endless shadows and whispered secrets. It set me on a path I could never have imagined, a path that leads ever deeper into the unknown. To those who read this, I offer a warning and an invitation. The world is stranger and more terrifying than you can imagine, but it's also filled with wonders beyond belief. If you ever feel a chill run down your spine, if you ever catch a glimpse of something unexplainable in a mirror, don't look away. You might just be seeing the truth that lies beyond the veil. But be prepared. Once you've seen it, you can never unsee it. Once you've reached through that mirror, a part of you will always remain on the other side. Are you ready to take that step? Are you prepared to confront the horrors and wonders that lurk just beyond our perception? If you are, then perhaps our paths will cross someday. Until then, be careful what you wish for, because in the world of the supernatural, wishes have a way of coming true in the most unexpected and terrifying ways. And remember, the next time you find yourself alone in an attic, facing an old mirror, think twice before you look too closely, because you never know what might be looking back.